Voting rights. This should be a pretty quick video. Let's consult the Constitution real quick. Alright, what do we got here? Let's see. Article 1, Section 2. Here we go. House of Representatives, elected by the people of the states. Good stuff. The Senate switched to direct election later on. Let's go down to Article 3, Article 2. Section 1, yes, the electors shall meet with their respective states and vote by ballot for 2 persons. Okay, let's cross-reference that with the Declaration of Independence. Let's see what we got here. All men created equal. Alright, easy peasy. Everyone can vote. End of video. Bye.
Wait, what?
So if you paid attention closely there, you will have noticed that the Constitution didn't actually guarantee anyone the right to vote. It just loosely said that people will vote to do the things, right? Even to this day, it still doesn't guarantee the right to vote. It just says that your right to vote can't be denied on the basis of skin color, sex, and age, as represented by the 15th, 19th, and 26th Amendments. It's that 15th Amendment one that's been the real kicker here. So after the 15th Amendment was ratified, there weren't any laws that explicitly barred people of color from voting, but unfortunately, racist legislators found a way around that. They did this by enacting poll taxes, literacy tests, and the grandfather clause. What are those? Well, a poll tax is pretty self-explanatory. It's literally a tax that you pay at the poll, and that prevented a lot of people from voting because it disproportionately affected people of color. Think about it, especially right after the Civil War, during the Reconstruction era, that community didn't have as much money typically as white people. So if you were forced to pay a tax at the poll, it barred more people of color from voting than it did white people. Same goes for literacy tests. These also disproportionately affected people of color, and this is largely because, actually almost exclusively, because people of color were not able to get the same quality of education that white people were able to get. And even if they did, these literacy tests were pretty confusing by design because they wanted them to fail. Right? On this example of a literacy test right there on the right-hand side of this image, take a look at number 10. I hope you can read it. It says, in the first circle below, write the last letter of the first word beginning with L. And it has a bunch of circles, numbered 1 through 5. I don't know what it's asking me to do. And you would figure that maybe a lot of poor white people would also feel the same way about this, and they wouldn't be on board with these literacy tests or the poll taxes, right? Well, yes, and that's where the grandfather clause comes in. So a common misconception is that the grandfather clause barred you from voting if your grandfather couldn't vote, and it's close to that, but not quite. What it actually does is makes you immune to having to pay a poll tax or take a literacy test if your grandfather could vote. Or technically, anyone you're related to could vote prior to 1867. So all of these combined made it really, really hard for people of color to vote during this time in the South. There were some superficial bits of legislation that expressed the intention to deal with this, but they didn't really produce any results. One of those was the Civil Rights Act of 1957, and it created a new division of the Department of Justice to monitor civil rights abuses. It was the first civil rights legislation in over 80 years at that point, but like I said, it was mostly symbolic. And then in 1960, there was another Civil Rights Act, and it established federal inspection of local voter registration, and it introduced penalties for obstructing those attempting to vote. You want proof that these really didn't do anything? Well, I give you Exhibit A. 6.7% of eligible black voters in Mississippi were registered to vote as of 1964. This was the lowest in the entire United States. Okay, so let's start talking about the road to change, starting with the Freedom Summer. So in 1964, over 700 mostly white people went to Mississippi to fight voter intimidation and discrimination. It was organized by CORE, the Congress for Racial Equality, and SNCC. or the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. They attempted to register 17,000 people to vote, but actually only succeeded in about 1,200. But they did establish 40 freedom schools, which served about 3,000 students. During this Freedom Summer, there were 80 beatings, 1,000 plus arrests, and 37 church burnings. Factions were growing between supporters of nonviolence and those who thought equality could not be achieved through peaceful means. Nevertheless, the awareness from the Freedom Summer helped pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and eventually the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and it led to the creation of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. And we'll discuss the Civil Rights Act and Voting Act later on in this video. Unfortunately, this Freedom Summer got pretty bloody. Michael Schwerner, James Chaney, and Andrew Goodman were murdered that summer when they went to Mississippi to help the cause. LBJ launched an investigation on this, and it found that these three men were brutally beaten and murdered by members of the KKK. What's worse is that the KKK had protection by the police, and even though the federal government charged the sheriff and the KKK members with civil rights violations, the state of Mississippi refused to press charges for the murder. So now let's turn our attention to the Selma March. In Marion, Alabama, 50% of the eligible voters were black, but only 1% were registered to vote, and that's unacceptable. To try to remedy this, peaceful demonstrations were held in Selma and surrounding communities. On February 18th, state troopers prevented marching around the courthouse in Marion. 700 black children were arrested for marching. Many were beaten, and Jimmy Lee Jackson was shot and killed. After this, they planned their most ambitious protest, a 54-mile walk from Selma to Montgomery, where they would then demand to present their grievances to the governor, Governor Wallace. So on March 7th, about 600 marchers set out from Brown AME Church in Selma, and as they crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge, they were met by state troopers who ordered them to disperse. Many were beaten, including John Lewis, Senator John Lewis, and this became known as Bloody Sunday, and we'll talk more about that in just a second. Outrage spread across the nation because of this event. 14 days later, President Johnson asked Congress to pass a National Voting Rights Act, and he sent federal troops to protect the marchers. 4 days later, there were 25,000 marchers at the state capitol in Montgomery. It's no surprise that the nation reacted so quickly. The photos from Bloody Sunday were brutal. They illustrated how savage these beatings were, and they illustrated that these police officers were motivated purely with racist intentions. These people, these marchers, were just expressing their First Amendment rights, and they were met with violence. Here's a quote from that day. "Suddenly we heard screams and gunshots, popping tear gas canisters. Before we could turn around, the front had turned too, and they were coming back across the bridge, screaming and hollering, and those men were behind, swinging their billy clubs, just hitting anybody. I don't know how long it lasted. It seemed like an eternity. If you could outrun those men on foot, you couldn't outrun the ones on horses. They ran those horses up into the crowd and were knocking people down. Horses rearing up, kicking people. Blood was everywhere." This makes me sick, and honestly it should make you uncomfortable too. The fact that this was ever allowed to happen, this unfiltered display of racial violence, is sickening. And it, like I said, it's no surprise that the country reacted so quickly to this. There is no other side to this. There is no way that you can justify the actions of these police officers that day. There is no reason that they should have done what they did. What's even more moving to me, though, is that they weren't deterred. Look at these photos from the march they actually did when they made it to the Capitol. They're all carrying American flags. They have "Vote" painted on their face. And after all of this foul treatment, this violence that they are experiencing, they're still fighting for the right to participate in this democracy. They want to be part of this country that has treated them so poorly. These heroes were trying to fix what was broken because they knew, like I always say, that our country will not be at its best. Our democracy will not be at its best until everyone has the right to vote, until everyone has the right to participate in our democracy. And unfortunately, the violence did not stop. This is Viola Liuzzo. She's a 39-year-old housewife from Michigan, and she became a martyr for civil rights when the KKK ran her off the road and killed her. All she was trying to do was drive the marchers back to Selma from Montgomery following the Selma March. She left behind 5 children. The Voting Rights Act did pass in 1965, and while it couldn't undo the death and the violence that came before it, it paved the way for a better future. It banned the use of literacy tests. It provided for federal oversight of voter registration in areas where less than 50% of the non-white population had not registered to vote. It authorized the U.S. Attorney General to investigate the use of poll taxes in state and local elections. And let's not forget the 24th Amendment, which was ratified in 1964, and this made poll taxes illegal in federal elections. Poll taxes in state elections were banned in 1966 by the U.S. Supreme Court. But unfortunately, that's not the end of the story. We'll get more into this case in a little bit later down in this unit, but this court case, the Shelby County versus Holder case, pretty much said that the Voter Rights Act is actually a little bit too intense, and that it's trying to fix problems that at the time of this case were no longer issues, and therefore the Voter Rights Act was unconstitutional. This opened the door for some pretty restrictive voting legislation to be passed further down the road, but we will get back to that later in the semester. So as we begin to wrap up this video, I want to go back to another quote by Joanne Bland. She said, "I used to say I want a colorblind world. Now, I just want a people-blind world," Joanne says. "As long as I'm a person, then treat me as such. I don't want my child to have any more than your child. I don't want your child to have any more than my child. All I want is for our children to have the same privileges. That's not too much to ask." Finally, let's look at what author and historian Jon Meacham has to say. He said, "Taken together with sit-ins to integrate lunch counters and other public facilities, and freedom rides to integrate interstate travel, the Selma March," Lewis recalled, "injected something very special into the soul and heart and the veins of America. It said, in effect, that we must humanize our social and political and economic structure. When people saw what happened on that bridge, there was a sense of revulsion all over America. Revulsion, then redemption. Is anything more American? Redemption is everything," Lewis said. "It is what we pray for. It is what we march for. It is the work of America, in the 60s and now and always." Revulsion, then redemption. I think Jon Meacham is making an excellent, sad, and unfortunately true observation here. Think about it. In this video, and in fact what we've been talking about pretty much this entire unit up to now, change hasn't really happened unless people are shown the atrocities that were going on. That's why it's so important that we're talking about this right now. Like I said earlier in the video, this should make us feel uncomfortable, because that's the only way we're going to keep progressing forward. It's unfortunate, but it's true. The story of civil rights and activism is not over. It's still being written. It's up to us, it's up to you guys to write the conclusion. Now, I know it sounds cheesy, but it's true. You guys have to use your voice, you guys have to use your right to vote to be the ones to make that change. That's all for this video. See you later.